Good evening. How's everybody? Lily is having a birthday today. Correct? So someone please remind me. Sing happy birthday to her. She'll be awake by then, we hope, right? We're in 2 Corinthians 3. That's where we were last week. And for some reason, something happened to time during the class, the course of my introduction to the class, and it ran away from us. And I think it was probably all the interaction from the class, and you wouldn't let me get to my outline, so I'm going to try to do that tonight, because I want to raise the question. We established last week, at least we tried to, that the Old Testament law is no longer binding. As Christians, we do not follow the Old Testament law of Moses. And we tried to describe more specifically or precisely what that law is, when it began, who it was given to, and the fact that it has come to an end. Its glory has faded away and is no longer binding. Oftentimes, when we make this point, which is a point that's made through much of the New Testament, if you look at much of, especially what Paul wrote, he spent a great deal of his time and his writing establishing that fact that 2 Corinthians 3 nails down for us. We're no longer under the Old Testament, we're under the New Testament. A lot of times people hear that and they're confused about that. They say, well, the Old Testament is part of the Bible, isn't it? Well, yes, it is. Well, you believe in the Bible, don't you? Yes, we do. Well, then, why are you saying the Old Testament is no longer applicable, or we're no longer obligated to follow the teaching of the law of Moses? And I would like to address that in this manner tonight. In Romans 15 and verse 4, Paul said, whatever things were written aforetime were written for our learning and our admonition, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So Paul tells us in Romans 15, one of the reasons we have the Old Testament. When he said the Scriptures there in Romans 15, he was referring primarily to that Old Testament that we've been talking about the last few weeks. And so that which was written aforetime, or before this age, was written for our learning. Well, if that's the case, we're no longer obligated and duty-bound to follow it and to obey its commands and precepts. What exactly do we learn from the Old Testament? Or is there any true profit or benefit to us? Well, Romans 15:4 says there is. And Paul tells us what that benefit is. That we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So it produces hope in us, if nothing else. But I want to talk to you a few moments about what the Old Testament teaches us. Some very important things that it teaches us. As you know, right now we have our mail out at the printers. And it'll be going out in hopefully a couple of weeks. We're going to be needing your help. I want to digress here for a moment. And I want to tell you about our new system. We're having our printing done out of house. And we're going to have it folded. The problem with all of that is, normally when we sort the routes, the rural routes, the city routes, the P.O. boxes, we sort that using our folding machine. We put the number of that route in the folding machine, we stick the papers in it, and it spits them out, and we stick them in the appropriate bin. What? We stick them in the appropriate bin, and that's that route, and this is that route, and the other route. Well, it's going to be folded when we get it this time. It's going to be full color on slick paper. So it's going to be unlike anything we've done before. The problem with that is, these routes, some of them have 775 pieces that go in them. So if we're expecting me and Deanna to sit down there with 22 routes in Villa Rica and roughly 14 routes in Temple, and we're going to have 4 routes in Dallas, and just, we're going to be here a while. So what I would like to ask is we used to, when I first came to Villa Rica, we had what we call folding parties. And we would take the printed paper and we would just fold them on a Sunday afternoon. Here's what I'm thinking. If I could get 25 or 30 people to meet maybe in a fellowship hall or downstairs in a print shop or wherever is convenient for us to meet, and we have those routes already in their bin, we have the label on the route. This is Route 1 of Villa Rica, Route 2 of Villa Rica, whatever. You sit down in front of that route, and we give you a stack of paper, say count 700 to go on that route. You do that, and you do Route 2, and you do Route 3. In just a few minutes, we've done all of them. So hopefully, we'll be able to get them done. And I'm saying that now, even though we haven't even gotten them back yet, because when we get them back, we need to get that step done as quickly as possible so that we can get them in the mail as quickly as possible, because there's a large section in this mail out with instructions to the community on how they can give public feedback on the Christian science standards, which Christians for Science is now urging and encouraging everyone to participate in. And of course, March 15th is the last date, right? And so we've got to get it in the mail as quickly as we can to get as much public feedback from our people as we possibly can. We're talking about 21,000 homes. Hopefully there'll be a significant number of those people that will see that and will take the time, maybe not only do it themselves, but tell somebody else, go to that website and give your feedback, and hopefully we can make a difference. So we're going to be doing that. I wanted you to be aware of it. You had a comment, Tommy, or a question?
Yeah, you could take something like a electronic scale and weigh one, and then you could weigh them all out, like 700, divided by whatever it is, you weigh the paper out. That'll be the same.
You got a scale that'll do that?
I don't, but I'm just saying that if you had a scale or a possibility to figure out how to do it.
I have scales in my bathroom. I don't believe anything they say to me. Yes, that's right. It's going to be going out a little bit earlier than usual. We generally try to get the mail out in people's homes about a week before the meeting. This will be about 2.5 weeks if everything goes according to plan prior to the meeting. But the meeting is coming up March the 20th to the 23rd with Brother Iverson from Valdosta. And so certainly want to be reminding about that also. But I mentioned the mail out because in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we learn about the origin of the universe. That itself is extremely significant. Now, there's a lot of people in our world, unfortunately, that are stupid. And I don't mean that to be ugly. I'm just being honest. They're just stupid people. And I say stupid in the English Standard Version sense of that word. They're stupid like animals. They don't think. They don't reason. They're not conscious of themselves. They get up and they say, I'm hungry, and they eat. I'm sleepy, and they sleep. Or I want to do something else, and they do whatever else the other thing is. They never stop to think, who am I? What am I? What am I doing here? What's my purpose? Am I going anywhere? Now, there are some people that have brains, and they use them, and they think. And sometimes that can be a burden, because the more you think, the more burdened you are with, who am I? Where did I come from? And what am I doing here? What's my purpose in this world? Do I have a destiny? Am I going anywhere? And the fact is, stupid people and smart people, thinking people and unthinking people all die. And so whether you're thinking or you're stupid or not, the fact is you're going to die. And if you had a brain and you were thinking properly, you would say, is anything going to happen to me when I die? Or is that just the end of me? Genesis chapters 1 and 2 addresses that. Now when I say this, I'm really describing for you a world view, or what we generally think of as a foundation for how we view everything in the world. And this is extremely important. That's why this standards in science is very important. Those who are pushing Darwinian evolution in our public schools know that our worldview makes a radical difference in every single aspect of our lives. The way we look at law and courts, the way we look at entertainment, the way we look at family, the way we look at culture, the way we look at religion, the way we look at ourselves, the way you look at everything is colored by your worldview. For example, if you believe that God is supreme, that God made the heaven and the earth and everything in it, that God made us in his image and after his likeness, that's going to have an impact on your behavior to a certain extent. It will determine whether you behave like an animal or not, or whether you behave a little more civilized or cultured, depending on how you see yourself. Now, if you see yourself as the product of biological evolution, well, then you may be like Nietzsche, and others who were very nihilistic and just said, what's the point in anything? I'm not worried about anything because nothing matters. And if there is no God, Nietzsche would be right. Nothing matters. So if you want to kill yourself, kill yourself. You want to kill somebody else, kill them if you can get away with it. Or whatever you want to do, because nothing matters. Our worldview makes a huge difference. So when someone asks me, why do you study the Old Testament? What's the point in studying the Old Testament? Well, for starters, we're beginning with the start of this universe. And so we're beginning with who we are, what we're doing here, what's our purpose here, and what is our destiny, if any. And those questions are addressed in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. Powerful stuff, and certainly worthy of our time and consideration. Tommy?
I was just talking about someone at this very thing today. I said, you got our school systems that are proud of the fact that they're having their own police force that they're trained to put in there. And I said, it's crazy that we have to come to this point where we have to have police officers in our school. It's because we took God out and replaced them with policemen. Because
What do you have against policemen, Tommy?
well, I don't have anything against them. I'm just saying that's what we have to put in place of God.
Yes.
When morality is taken out, and you teaching kids that abortion is that life is not important. You come from the slime pool, the fittest survives. When we educate there's no God or anything that higher responsibility. So you got to replace it with something. So they replace it with law that they pass, policemen and anything like that, metal detectors and all, place of God. And that's what they think they're proud of protecting their kids from that. All they've done is just, give them a mindset that, hey, biggest person with a gun wins.
You're kind of getting ahead of me because it's kind of where we're going our lesson tonight. We're going to get there. But when we get to some of the founders and their view of our nation, it's amazing because they knew, and they said in a different way, but they said the same thing you were just saying, that this republic that they set up, that they established, was based on this foundational principle. The citizens of this republic have to be a God-fearing, religious people. And not just God-fearing, but people who believe in Jesus Christ. We hear it all the time. We were a Judeo-Christian nation. That is not true. The founders did not think of themselves as Jews in any sense of the word. They thought of themselves as establishing a Christian nation. And they were very specific about that. And so they understood that the freedoms, which are unprecedented in this nation, these freedoms are conditioned on the idea that the citizens of this country will govern themselves. They will keep themselves in check. And they will keep themselves in check because they'll be at church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, during the week. They'll read their Bibles. They'll stay with their families. They'll love God. They'll love their neighbor. You don't have to treat people like they're slaves if they're going to follow the gospel. So the gospel is, and they knew this to be true, liberating. But you remove the gospel. We start by taking, this is ironic, but we take the Ten Commandments off the walls in our classrooms, which, again, we've said we don't specifically follow the Ten Commandments, but it wouldn't hurt, would it? If we were telling our kids, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill, you shouldn't covet what your neighbors. I mean, if we could just teach our kids that, it wouldn't hurt them. But nevertheless, we take all references, all symbols of God out of our classrooms, and we have to replace it with something. We have to control kids somehow. And so what do? We hire our own police force, or we have metal detectors, and we have teachers pulling their hair out. And it's a crazy world because we've lost sight of what we're saying here tonight. In the 8th Psalm, the psalm writer, it's a beautiful psalm of David. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, What is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you visit him? For you made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, that pass through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. You know what's sad? I know there are people that think I'm an animal hater. I'm not an animal hater. I like animals. I love animals. Fried, boiled, baked. I like them in all forms. I have nothing against animals. Seriously. I wear them sometimes too, but I have nothing against animals. But the further away from God we move as a society, the more inclined, and you see it in our commercials. You hear it in popular radio talk. You see it all over Facebook. I mean, you see it in strange places, but the further away from God we remove ourselves, the more on an even par we seem to be moving with animals. And we see people and animals on an equal plane. I find that extremely offensive. Mainly because Genesis 1:26, God said, after creating all the other lower creatures, God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the... You see what I'm saying about your worldview? Everything is colored by your worldview. And so how do you see yourself? Where do you fit in the world? And how do you view others? How do you view animals? How do you view the environment? I'm not anti-environment. I don't believe in man-made global warming. I think it's the biggest bunch of junk I've ever heard in my life. That doesn't mean that I want to go out and pollute the planet. That doesn't mean that I don't care about being a responsible citizen on planet Earth. God told us to be responsible caretakers of this wonderful planet, this home that he provided us to live in while we're here. So we have a responsibility to it. But again, if we keep it in perspective, rather than worshiping Mother Earth, which seemed to be the case, we would be moving in a very different direction. Again, what's the purpose of my life? Who am I? We also learn a great deal studying the Old Testament, that is. We learn a great deal about God. We don't just learn about ourselves, we learn about who he is. If I were to ask you, just generally off the top of your head, studying the Old Testament, what would you tell me that you know about God from reading the Old Testament? What?
I am that I am.
I am that I am. What does that mean?
He's eternal and has no one above him.
Okay, he didn't say I was. He didn't say I will be. He said I am, right? So he just is. What else do you know about God from the Old Testament? Who? He's just? What does that mean? Huh? He's fair. Okay. You know, Abraham in Genesis 18, wasn't it? Or 19. When he was talking to God in the flesh, Abraham said to him, will not the judge of all the earth do right? And so I think that's what you're getting. We do learn that God is just. He is fair. Yes, sir, you had a comment?
God has a plan for man's redemption.
God has a plan. So he's a God of order, God of plan, a God of design. Very good.
Merciful.
He's merciful.
But he's also fair, but I guess what I'm reading right now, I've been trying to read, the Bible every day or whatever, and I'm to the point where, Moses, God's ready to kill them all because he's tired of them grumbling and running. But, but Moses turns around and Moses is ready to just tell God just to kill them all because he's tired of it too. But yet God, he doesn't let it happen. He gives him another chance.
You're talking about Exodus 32, aren't you? That's in my notes. It's right here. I want to read that passage. This is one of the most fascinating things I've read anywhere in the Bible. Because Moses was a man. You remember that, right? Moses was just a man. But he was chosen by God to be the leader, of course, and the mediator of the Old Covenant. But he was just a man. He was no different than us. He was just a human being. And yet, the relationship he sustained with God was unlike the relationship God seemed to have sustained with any other man. It's particularly like you see here in Exodus chapter 32. Verse 7 of Exodus 32, you got to listen carefully to what's being said here back and forth between these two. God and Moses are going back and forth. The Lord said to Moses, "Go get down, for your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" And the Lord said, did you notice how God said that to Moses? Those people, Moses, that you brought out of... You know, I don't know about you, but that I somehow feel closer in a more personal way to God when I hear him speaking that way. Because God sounds a little Celtic here in the sense that he's like, those are your people. It's like, when your husband and wife are, arguing about their kids not behaving right. Now that's your kid. And God's, in essence, that's what he's saying to Moses. Well, now, who delivered Israel from Egyptian slavery? Whose people were they? And God said, Moses, those people you brought out of Egypt, they've... Yeah, right, Lord, I did that all on my own. Anyway, verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and indeed is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and may consume them. I will make of you a great nation." So what does that mean, consume them? How? How would he do that? Well, he could do it any number of ways, couldn't he? Yeah, he did. He opened the earth one time, and all those rebels went down whole into the earth, and it closed back on top of them. Or the plagues, or as the Egyptian army came into the Red Sea, he just baptized them all permanently. And they washed up on the seashore. He could wipe them out in any number of ways. Just speak the word, and they'd all die.
Serpents.
He did that too. Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, "Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people?" You have to admire Moses. He realizes he's speaking to God. And yet, isn't it amazing that God would condescend to Moses and allow this conversation to take place? This is quite profound. Why would you let your wrath burn hot against your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, "He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth"? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, "I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken I give to your descendants, that they shall inherit it forever." So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. That's amazing. I don't know about you, but that says a lot about God, doesn't it? It says that in some sense we can relate to him. We can understand him. We've been there with our own kids, probably. Sometimes your grandkids, rarely, but sometimes with your grandkids, like those are your grandkids. Anyway, they're just moments when you see pictures like this in the Old Testament that are quite revealing, aren't they, about who God is, what God is like, and the fact that God is willing to listen to Moses. Now, here's a question I have for you. And I ask this in all due respect. Did Moses calm God down? Or was this just a show that God was putting on for Moses' benefit? I've been told that. I don't believe that.
Well,
I think God was genuinely angry, and he was going to tell Moses, "You step aside, I'm going to wipe these people out." And Moses intervened, Moses interceded, and God relented from his wrath. That's what the text said.
we've got to remember the providence of God,
Yes,
the foreknowledge of God. All
Yes.
of this is working together.
yes.
So it was maybe
Yeah, when we get into the foreknowledge thing, that's where it always kind of gets a wrench and everything, because, God knew it was going to happen, so therefore, yes, Joe? I knew the Broncos were going to win, by the way. Yes, Joe?
I'm just going to bring out what Paul said in Romans 11:22. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity.
That's exactly right.
So you see both instances in the Old Testament. And then so many people nowadays say, well, that's the God of the Old Testament. But Micah says he has not changed. I am God, change not.
No, he doesn't change. That's right.
What Paul tells us, he's still the same God. And we have to recognize that. So many people don't.
I'll tell you what's amazing, though. If Moses is indeed reasoning with God, wow, that God would let a man reason with him. You say, well, he wouldn't do that. He did that with Abraham. Abraham bartered with God. That's where we get the expression, Jew you down. He was literally trying to Jew God. Well, we find 50 souls with 40 souls. What about 10 souls? Okay, that's enough. That's as low as I'm going to go. 10 souls. We couldn't find 10, unfortunately. But nevertheless, God can be reasoned with. You can talk to God, and you can reason with him. Sometimes people say, well, I believe in prayer, but it's more therapy than anything else. I don't believe that. I believe that we should pray to influence the outcome of what's happening in our lives, because God hears us and God listens to us. You say, but Jesus said God knows what you're going to ask for, you ask it. That's true. Perhaps he knew what you're going to ask for. But you can see where God can be reasoned with. That doesn't negate my responsibility to reason with him. Yeah, Tommy?
I just fix to say the same thing. If God couldn't be reasoned with, your prayers would be just,
Yeah.
You couldn't see the hope there if you have God already knows your mind. Well, then also he might have referred to Moses that's your people on a human standpoint. It would be his people because they were thinking in a human standpoint. But God turned around, when he turned around and turned back to God, hey, look, we're all spiritual. But
Well,
maybe
God.
he just do it on a human standpoint. But your people, if they were thinking human thoughts, that's how it would be. And it would be your people at that time.
Well, you remember the prophet that married a prostitute, and God instructed him to. And the reason God instructed him to marry a prostitute, so that he knew what the prostitute was going to do. He didn't make the prostitute do it, even though he knew what the prostitute would do. But anyway, he knew what she would do. And she did, and he put her away. But then he bought her back. And the point was, God was saying, this is my relationship with Israel. I married her. I married Israel, but now I'm divorcing Israel. And so God, in the same sense, these are children that are disobedient. I want nothing to do with them. I'm not going to claim them. Later, he's married to them, but they're not my wife anymore. So, God can, we understand we're like that too. You understand? We say, well, how could God, well, we're like that. Well, why are we like that? Because he's like that. He made us like himself. Does he laugh? Does God laugh? Well, the proverb writer said he does. So we know he has a sense of humor. He made a giraffe. We know that he's colorful. He likes variety. There's so many things you can learn about God by just looking at creation. But again, we're looking at the Old Testament. What do we know about God? And this is a powerful point that we're making. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. And we see that on display right here in Exodus 32. He was mad enough to wipe Israel off the map. But when Moses reasoned with him, he backed off. And he relented from his anger. And God said, I'm not going to destroy them. We're glad that God can be reasoned with like that. But this is not the only time that God relented from his anger. There were many instances, particularly as they're wandering through the wilderness, where God's having to constantly restrain himself. And if you put yourself in God's position, which we can't, but you could try to imagine what it would be like to deal with a thankless generation of people that repeatedly questioned your love, that repeatedly questioned your abilities, that repeatedly questioned your intentions for them. It's ridiculous. You have to wonder, why didn't God just wipe them out and say, Moses, I'm sorry, you made your case, but these people, they're not to be reasoned with. And so I don't understand it myself, other than God is long-suffering and merciful. And I'm grateful for that. Lester?
That's just one of the many examples of God being patient with us.
Yes. Very much. Yeah, Herman?
How long, sir, do you think he was in the time of Noah?
In the time of Noah? Well, Noah wasn't a perfect man either. And his children were not perfect either. But they weren't apparently as far gone as the rest of the generation. Nearly 2,000 years of human history, if you count the genealogies, the list of names and dates. About 2,000 years of human history prior to the flood. A different world, by the way, than the one we have now. That's interesting, isn't it? And then we have the flood, and then we have about, 1,700 years, maybe a little more, depending on how you count the dates. Yes, friend?
I think another attribute of God is that God is loving, and I know it's in the New Testament, not the Old Testament, but John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world." And what did he do because of it? He sent his son, whose blood flows backwards as well as forwards.
It does. It flows in both directions. Again, the love of God is on display. The wrath of God is on display. The justice of God is on display. The mercy of God is on display. Over and over and over again. The flood is an example. The cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, God's wrath revealed there. Again, with characters, individual characters like David and his sin with Bathsheba. I mean, there are instances like that where, again, over and over again, God repeated, his wrath against David because of his sin, but also his forgiveness and his mercy in letting David continue to reign. Yes.
We learn a lot in the Old Testament that he's very orderly about the way he's set everything in motion. And we can study things very orderly and know that there has to be a direction because it's so precise. We can predict where any planet to be 100 years down.
Because the movements of the planets are all in.
So orderly, and he followed the order and he never deviated from it.
Interesting word you're using, because when you come to the law itself, the giving of the law, and the instruction to the priest, and the construction of the tabernacle, and all that was associated with the old law, and the worship of it, the Hebrew writer reminds us that God said to Moses, "See that you make all things according to the pattern shown to you." And there was a divine pattern, and whenever it was deviated from, there were severe consequences. Nadab and Abihu stand out as a very strong point, one that we need to study more, I think, in our day and time, where God was approached in worship, but was very displeased with the manner in which they were worshiping him, because it was not according to his pattern. They deviated from the pattern. And we might argue, well, it seemed rather innocent, their deviation. It doesn't matter how innocent it may seem to us. When God says do something in a certain way, then that's what we're duty-bound and obligated to do. We learn also, again, point being made here, that God certainly expects us to worship him according to his word. And we learn that beginning in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, two different kinds of worshipers. One's accepted, the other's rejected. And that continues throughout the Old Testament. In fact, it's hammered home again and again and again. God expects us to worship him properly. I see a hand somewhere. Yes, Roger.
When we talk about the old law, we're not talking in restriction to just the law of Moses, because there's a number of lessons that can be learned in the prophets, both the major and the minor prophets of the Old Testament.
Yes. Well, the prophets are lumped together in the law. According to Jesus, there's the law and the Psalms and the prophets. And those three are all bound together. Of course, the prophets were not revealing anything new as far as the law is concerned, but they were reminding primarily the kings of their age to follow that law, and speaking about particular judgments that would be brought to bear for not following that law, which reminds me again, 2 Kings 25, about Jeremiah and Isaiah and many other great prophets who warned over and over again of nations that turn away from God and what follows. 2 Kings 25, 1 to 10. I mean, we're not going to read all of this. It's just too much to read. But let me summarize by saying that the final days of the king Zedekiah here in Jerusalem were gruesome times. When Nebuchadnezzar and his forces came against the city, he had to flee for his life. He was captured along with his sons. and he was brought for judgment before King Nebuchadnezzar. His sons were slain before his very eyes, and then his eyes were gouged out, and then he was put in fetters and carried to Babylon, where he eventually died himself. And this was the same king that refused over and over again to listen to the plea of Jeremiah, great prophet, to return to the law and to return to God's way and to God's pattern. We see in the Old Testament over and over again, primarily in the prophets, God's attitude during the period of the judges, during the period of the united and divided kingdoms, where God's view of those nations that turn against him or that forget him, all of them will be turned unto death or into hell, to use the King James Version. When you think about our nation, I think about it often. I think about what someone said to me not long ago. America is changing. Indeed it is. We have a president who said, going into office, I'm going to fundamentally change this country. And he has. And the party with him has fundamentally changed this country. I'm not going to give him all the credit, because the change was already in place. We were already on this trajectory before he ever was elected. He did not single-handedly do this. He may have poured gasoline on the fire that was already raging, but we've been on this downward slope for many decades now, and it's a tragedy. And it is a factual point to be made. America is fundamentally changing. But what should be our response to that? Should we just sit back and say, oh, well, I guess America's changing, so let's just give into the change, embrace it, and adopt it, and go along with the flow? Or should we stand up and speak out for righteousness? What should we do? And how should we conduct ourselves?
Well, the Old Testament tells us,
Okay, the Old Testament tells us what to do, doesn't it?
my people who are called by my name
Shall humble themselves and seek my face and pray, turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, will heal their land. That's exactly right.
I think we sat around too long.
We've sat around for too long, haven't we? You know, when
We get condemned to speak out. It's like,
somebody might call us a name or something. I wonder why we're afraid of being called names. Are you afraid of being called a name? Really? I could call you anything, it'd be all right? Yeah. Especially you, huh?
My daddy and mother were called religious fanatics for as long as I can remember.
Well, were they?
No,
They just
not my mind.
they just believed God, didn't they? You know, we talk about the founders quite often, and we reference them. I'd like to share with you some thoughts from the founders. As you know, we had another primary yesterday in New Hampshire. It's now coming to South Carolina. It is an election year. I know I haven't been going there, so whether you pat me on the back, I'll do it myself. But I'm a reforming political junkie and news junkie. I'm getting better. But some things are unavoidable, and this is one of those years. And I think about who we have running for office. Who do we need to elect? Here's a thought. Bernie Sanders, I know you say, don't get involved. I'm just going to make a point. The man claims to be, is proud of the fact that he is a socialist. Now, from the time I was old enough to remember, our country has been at war. We called it a Cold War against socialist countries. We now have a socialist senator who's running for president. Now, yesterday, he received more votes. Number of people voted for him than the top two Republican candidates who took the top two spots. That would be Trump and Kasich. You count the numbers that voted for those two men, combine them, and Bernie Sanders got more votes for himself alone as a socialist. You say, well, that's New Hampshire. That's the United States of America. We have a lot of people that are believing in, accepting, and voting for outright socialism. Now, there's a lot of things we can say about that, but that's something perhaps you ought to put in the back of your mind. It ought to bother you. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. John Adams said to his friend Thomas Jefferson on December the 25th, that's Christmas, by the way, in this letter, he said, I've examined all religions as well as my narrow sphere, my straitened means, and my busy life would allow. And the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world. It contains more philosophy than all the libraries I have seen. Who's John Adams? Who's Thomas Jefferson? Who are these people? And why does it matter what they believed? To the founders of this country. Constitutional Convention of 1787 had in the original manuscript this speech, a portion of this speech I'll share with you, penned by Benjamin Franklin. God governs in the affairs of men, or man rather, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. Also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. He was talking about building this country. This was during the Revolutionary War. And there was great concern they're going to lose this war to the greatest military power on planet Earth at that time. I mean, the British Army and Navy was the most powerful military force on the planet. And we had a bunch of farmers with pitchforks hiding out in trees, and these people are saying, how are we ever going to win this thing? And Benjamin Franklin and others realized, we're not going to do it on our own. It will only be if God helps us. Did they succeed? Well, here we are. Now, the question I have is, what have we done with that success? And what have we done with this hard-fought and earned freedom? Are we going to squander it? Let it simply just go by the wayside? It's really tragic when you think about it. But again, the Old Testament teaches us, among many other things, how God views nations that forget his manifold blessings and turn against him. Yes, Roger?
Not long ago, I was substituting in a history class in which I was to show a film on the founders of this country. And they had a direct opposite view of the founders of this country than what you just presented.
Yeah, I know.
So that shows me, and it should show us, that what our kids are getting is negative interest in our country because of things like that.
I'd like to share with you their words. I don't want to share what my opinion is of them. Just what did they say? Just what did they write? And if you can read that, it tells you all you need to know about what they thought. You had a comment, Daddy? So we just read their words and let their words speak for themselves. But again, if the Old Testament teaches us anything, it teaches us that God cares about what we as a nation and society do with our freedoms and our blessings. And certainly we have an opportunity to make that known in this election year.